The blade was at Lazare Vandrak's throat before Nadia even understood what she was seeing. She had been carrying a tray of crystal goblets down the east corridor of Vandrak House when the door to the heir's private study burst open, and 3 members of the Obsidian Council dragged him out in chains forged from blackened silver, the kind that burned through vampire skin like acid through paper. Lazare's white hair fell across his face, matted with blood at the temple, and his pale hands were locked behind his back in manacles that suppressed his power so completely that even the air around him felt ordinary, stripped of the electric danger he normally carried without effort. Councillor Heir Dusk, a vampire so ancient his skin had gone translucent at the edges, pressed the edge of a ceremonial blade against Lazare's throat and smiled with the particular pleasure of a man who had been waiting centuries for this moment. The heir is stripped of title pending formal tribunal, Erevan announced to no one in particular, because the corridor was empty except for one human maid frozen in place with a silver tray in her hands. His eyes slid to Nadia with calculated indifference. "You leave." Nadia did not leave. She set the tray down slowly on the narrow side table against the wall, keeping her eyes on Lazare, who was watching her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Not fear exactly, something more controlled and more devastating, warning. He was warning her away, she ignored it. "On whose authority?" she asked. The question landed in the corridor like a dropped stone. Erevan turned to look at her fully for the first time, and the contempt in his ancient eyes was almost physical. "On the authority of the Obsidian Council, which governs the affairs of vampire nobility by blood law and ancient compact. Humans do not speak in council matters." He turned back to Lazare as though she had already ceased to exist. "The blood law requires a formal witness to any stripping of title," Nadia said, her voice steady, even though her heart was hammering so hard she could feel it in her temples. She had spent 4 months in this house. 4 months reading every document that passed through the library, every council protocol posted on the staff notice board, every historical record stored in the East Archive room, where she dusted shelves twice weekly and read everything within reach. She had not known why she was accumulating that knowledge. Now she knew. Erevan went very still. Lazare made a sound that might, under any other circumstances, have been a laugh. "The Compact of 12 requires," Nadia continued carefully, "that any formal action against a recognized heir must be witnessed by a party with no personal interest in the outcome. A servant without title or allegiance qualifies under Article 7 of the Compact. If you remove him without that witness' signature, every action taken tonight is void and reversible by any sitting lord within the bloodline." The silence that followed was the most dangerous silence Nadia had ever stood inside. Then Erevan smiled, and it was worse than his anger would have been. "Clever little human," he said softly. "Someone taught you dangerous things." He pressed the blade harder against Lazare's throat, and a thin line of dark crimson appeared. "No one taught me," Nadia said. "I read, and that was how it began. Not with a grand gesture or a declaration. With a human maid in a corridor, a silver tray abandoned on a side table, and 4 months of secret reading that she had not known was building toward anything at all. She had come to Vandrak House through the city's Vampire Human Employment Registry, which was a quietly modern institution that most humans in the upper districts treated the way people treated insurance policies, necessary and deeply uncomfortable to think about directly. The registry placed humans in vampire household service with a set of protections that looked comprehensive on paper and were considerably less comprehensive in practice. Nadia had needed money. Her mother's medical bills were not romantic or interesting. They were simply real and staggering, and the registry paid 3 times the going rate for humans willing to serve in vampire-affiliated houses. She had not expected to last 4 months. She had expected to be frightened every single day. The first part turned out to be wrong. The second part turned out to be right, but not in the way she had anticipated. Lazare Vandrak had not been what the city whispered about him. The city whispered quite a lot. She had heard it before she ever set foot in Vandrak House. He was volatile, they said, dangerously unpredictable, a throwback to old-world violence in an era that required political subtlety. He had killed 2 rival heirs in formal duels before the age of 300. He kept no human staff for more than a season because he frightened them away. He refused to attend court functions, refused to engage the council, refused to perform the social rituals that kept vampire nobility from devolving into open warfare. He was, by every measure the old families used, unsuitable for the crown his father intended to pass to him. What Nadia found when she arrived was a man who worked 16 hours a day in a library so extensive it occupied an entire hidden subfloor beneath the house, who left precise and courteous instructions for staff in a handwriting so disciplined it looked engraved, who maintained the most extensive archive of vampire human treaty law in any private collection she had ever encountered, and who was visibly and genuinely uncomfortable when she thanked him for the winter coat that appeared on her designated hook in the staff anteroom on the first cold morning of November. "Standard provision," he had said, not looking at her, his white hair swept back from a face so pale and architecturally beautiful. It still sometimes startled her, even after weeks of proximity. "The house maintains adequate conditions for all residents. It has my name on the label," she had pointed out. He had walked away without responding, which she had gradually come to understand was his version of admitting something. She had started reading in earnest after the third week, when she discovered that the council had been filing procedural challenges against Lazare's inheritance claim, at a rate of approximately one per month for the past 2 years. Each challenge was different. Each challenge, when examined closely, was groundless, and each one was structured in a way that required Lazare to respond in person, to appear before the council in formal session, and defend his legitimacy in rooms designed to humiliate him, with procedures drafted to make him look volatile and unsuitable regardless of the actual merit of his responses. It was not a political dispute. It was a trap built from protocol. She had not told him what she was doing. She had simply read and remembered and waited for the purpose of it to become clear. The purpose became clear the night Heir Vandrak pressed a blade to his throat in the east corridor. The standoff lasted another 47 seconds, which felt considerably longer. Then Heir lowered the blade by half an inch, which was not a concession but was a calculation. "Take the witness statement," he said to the man on his left. "We proceed correctly." "You will release him from the silver chains while I give the statement," Nadia said. Blood Law Article 9. No heir may be restrained during a formal witness proceeding. Lazare's eyes found hers across the corridor, and something passed through them that she had no precise name for, that she was not ready to name even to herself. The chains came off. The moment they did, the air in the corridor changed completely. It was subtle to anyone who had not spent 4 months learning to read Lazare Vandrak the way she had learned to read his documents. A slight straightening, a settling of his shoulders. The return of something ancient and tremendous to the space immediately around him, as though the world was reorienting to accommodate what he actually was. He looked at Heir Vandrak, and Heir, who was centuries older, took an involuntary half-step back. "You've made a significant procedural error tonight," Lazare said. His voice was calm in the way that very deep water is calm, with considerable pressure hidden beneath the surface. "Several, actually. My witness has already identified 2. I expect she has found others." Nadia had found 4. The formal witness statement took 11 minutes, during which she laid out each procedural violation with the care of someone who understood that precision was the only weapon available to her, and she could not afford to waste a single shot. The council representative writing her words down had gone progressively paler throughout the process, which she chose to interpret as a good sign. Heir left with his 2 associates without another word. He did not need to say anything. The nature of his exit communicated sufficient information. When the corridor was empty, Nadia leaned against the wall and let out a breath she had been holding for approximately the last 12 minutes. "You could have left," Lazare said from across the corridor. He had not moved from the spot where the chains had released him. "You should have left. The compact required a witness. The compact would have been invoked by my legal counsel within the week. The title challenge would have been overturned. You did not need to stand in front of an obsidian council blade to accomplish something that time would have accomplished without you." Nadia looked at him. "And what happens to you between now and within the week?" He did not answer. "What happens in the tribunal they were taking you to?" she pressed. How many things can go wrong in 7 days for someone who has been stripped of title and held without formal charge? How many accidents happen in council custody that can be convincingly attributed to the instability everyone already believes you have? The muscle in his jaw worked once. "You read the procedural records," he said. "It was not a question. I read everything in this house that was available to me." Why? She did not have a simple answer to that. She had been asking herself the same question for weeks, in the quiet of the staff room when the house was dark, trying to understand why she had started caring, when caring was the one thing she could not afford. She had come for money. She had stayed for reasons that were becoming increasingly difficult to categorize as professional. "Because someone should," she said finally. The inadequacy of the answer sat between them. Lazare crossed the corridor in 3 steps, and the proximity was sudden enough that she had to concentrate on not moving back. He was considerably taller than her. All vampires carried that quality of compressed, controlled force, but it was more pronounced in him than anyone else she had encountered, as though his restraint was a deliberate choice he made continuously and deliberately. He looked down at her for a long moment. "You know what Erevan will do now," he said quietly. "Yes, he will come back with something that cannot be countered by procedural argument. I know. You made yourself visible to him tonight. You are no longer invisible. I know that too." His expression shifted through something she had no word for. "You should leave the house, take your pay and go. I will provide a reference and supplemental compensation for the disruption to your employment." "Is that an order?" "It is a strong recommendation from someone who understands what Erevan Dusk is capable of." She met his eyes, which were the deep grey of sky before serious weather, and she thought about the coat with her name on the label, and the way he had left meticulous instructions, so none of the staff would have to navigate uncertainty on their own, and the treaty archives she had spent weeks reading that were clearly his life's work toward a version of vampire-human relations that would look very different from what currently existed, and she thought about the look on his face in those chains. "Tell me what we do next," she said. The next 3 days moved at the speed of genuine crisis, which is to say, they moved very fast and also seemed to last considerably longer than 72 hours. Lazare's legal counsel was a severe and ancient vampire woman named Seraphiel Morn, who had been practicing blood law longer than the current city had existed, and who looked at Nadia with the particular expression of someone calculating variables she had not expected to include in the equation. Nadia laid out the procedural violations she had documented, and Seraphiel listened without interrupting, which she later understood was the vampire equivalent of extraordinary respect. "She's right on all 4 points." Seraphiel told Lazare afterward, apparently having decided Nadia could be spoken about in the third person without this being impolite. "The challenge is technically void, but Erevan knows that. He filed it, knowing it would be contested and overturned. The question is what he was creating space for while our attention was on the procedural fight." "A distraction," Nadia said. Both of them looked at her. "While you are focused on the procedural challenge, what is actually happening? What is moving while everyone is looking at the wrong thing?" Lazare went still in the particular way he did when something clicked into place behind his eyes. He moved to the large table that dominated his private study, covered in documents and archival material, and began sorting through it with a focused speed that was slightly uncanny to watch. "The Valaric bloodline petition," he said. Seraphiel made a sound of understanding and something close to alarm. Nadia crossed to the table. "Explain." Lazare looked at her for a half-second, and she had the impression he was still not entirely accustomed to being directed, even politely, by someone who was technically in his employ. Then he sorted several documents to the front and spread them where she could read them. "The crown cannot pass to my father's line if a senior bloodline files a legitimate petition of succession challenge before the formal coronation," he said. "The Valaric line is older than ours by 2 generations. They have always lacked formal grounds to challenge because the Vandrak succession has been formally uncontested. If my title is stripped, even temporarily, for any reason, including procedural violations during a council action, it creates a 2-week window in which the succession can be formally contested." "And the tribunal was set to last," Nadia said, already doing the arithmetic. "At least 10 days. 14 by the council's proposed schedule. The room was very quiet. So everything Erevan did tonight was designed not to actually remove you, she said slowly, but to create the window long enough for the Veleric petition to be filed and accepted. The procedural violations were intentional. He expected them to be contested. He expected it to take time. He may have even anticipated someone would catch the violations. Because it doesn't matter, Lazare said, and the controlled anger in his voice was the most human sound she had heard from him. The petition window opens the moment the title is stripped, regardless of the reason it was stripped or how quickly it is restored. He only needed 10 days. How many days do we have? The title was stripped for approximately 41 minutes before you invoked the compact and required his release. Lazare met her eyes. That 41 minutes began the window. So you have 13 days and 19 hours to consolidate your succession before the Veleric line can file. Consolidation requires the lawful endorsement of at least 4 of the 7 great bloodlines. 3 of the 7 have already been aligned against me for 2 years. Which 3? He named them. Seraphil listed their current political positions, their primary objections to Lazare's claim, and the historical nature of their opposition. Nadia listened to everything, and then sat down in the chair across from the table and thought hard for about 2 minutes while both vampires waited, which she appreciated. Your father, she said. Does he support you? My father selected me as heir. His support is not the question. I mean, does he actively, publicly, demonstrably support you? Not on paper, in the rooms where the other bloodlines make their decisions. A longer pause this time. My father and I have significant disagreements about method, Lazare said carefully. That is not what I asked. No, he said. He believes I am capable of the crown. He does not always believe in the paths I choose toward it. Then here is what I think needs to happen, Nadia said. And she watched something shift in his expression as she said it, something that was not entirely comfortable, and was also not, she thought, unwelcome. You need to stop trying to earn the endorsements on your terms. You have spent 2 years responding to challenges on the council's schedule, fighting on ground they selected. The bloodlines watching, you see someone reactive. They see someone who has to defend himself constantly. They do not see the person who built the most comprehensive treaty archive in private hands, or the person who has been drafting actual frameworks for stable vampire-human governance for a decade, or the person who left a winter coat with a staff member's name on it, because he understood that cold mornings were a problem he could solve. The air in the room changed again. Seraphil was watching Nadia with an expression that had shifted considerably from its starting point. You are suggesting, Lazare said slowly, that the endorsement campaign should not be a political argument. It should be a demonstration. You are being written off because everyone believes the narrative Erevan built about you. Volatile, unsuitable, old-world violent. But everything you actually do contradicts that narrative. The contradiction just isn't visible because you're not showing it to anyone. I don't show things, he said, and the simplicity of it told her more about him than any document had. I know, she said. I spent 4 months finding them anyway. She did not let herself examine what the expression on his face meant. Not then. There was too much to do. The next 8 days were unlike anything Nadia had experienced. Lazare moved through the political landscape of vampire aristocracy with a purposefulness that was newly directed, and she moved with him, which surprised them both. She had expected to be returned to her household duties once the immediate crisis was articulated and handed over to Seraphil. Instead, she found herself in rooms she had no formal business being in, seated at tables where ancient bloodlines regarded her with everything from curiosity to open hostility, translating between what Lazare was and what he needed them to see. She was very good at it. She understood, in a way he sometimes did not, that what looked like restraint to her looked like coldness to people who were not paying close attention. She understood that his precision read as arrogance to those who had not seen him spend 3 hours getting the single treaty clause exactly right, because the exact right words would actually protect people. She understood the gap between what he was and what he appeared to be, and she had an unusual talent for bridging it. On the 4th day, in a meeting with Lord Casimir Vreth of the Second Bloodline, she told a story she had not planned to tell. She described finding the winter coat, She described the staff instructions, she described the treaty archives and what they contained, and what building them had clearly required over the years, the discipline and the vision and the absolute refusal to give up on a version of the world that was better than the one currently operating. Casimir Vreth was 340 years old and had survived 4 succession crises. He listened to Nadia's story with the expression of a man encountering something genuinely new. "You trust him," Casimir said. "Not to Lazare, to her." "I do," she said. "Why?" "You are human, you have every reason not to." She thought about the answer she could give, the careful political one, the one that was strategically useful. Then she looked at Lazare across the room where he was speaking with Casimir's senior counsel, and she gave the honest one instead. "Because he has had every opportunity to treat me as something lesser and has not once taken it," she said. "And that is not a small thing. In this world, in the political reality he lives in, choosing not to take that opportunity costs him something. He pays that cost every time. I have watched him do it for 4 months. That tells me who he is more clearly than any formal endorsement could." Casimir Vreth gave his endorsement the following morning. The 5th day brought the threat she had been expecting and Lazare had warned her about. She came back from the archive room to find her staff quarters had been searched. Nothing was taken, that was the point. The message was clear, and it was from Erevan, and it said, "I know where you sleep, and I know you cannot stay in this house indefinitely, and eventually you will be somewhere I can reach." She sat on the edge of her narrow bed and breathed steadily through a fear she was not going to let disable her. Lazare was at her door in 8 minutes. She did not know how he knew. She suspected the house had a communication system she had not been introduced to, or possibly that he was simply paying very close attention to where she was at all times, which was its own kind of information. He looked at the disturbed room, and then at her, and the cold fury that moved through his expression was the most contained, and therefore most frightening anger she had ever seen. "Pack what you need," he said. "I'm not leaving. You are moving to the secure wing. It is not negotiable, Lazare." His name in her mouth without any title seemed to land in him the way strong things land, with weight. Nadia. Her name in his voice was something she stored somewhere she did not entirely have access to yet. "I cannot ensure your safety in this quarter of the house. The secure wing has been warded against unauthorized entry since the house was built. Erevan cannot reach you there. This is not a political consideration. This is not a strategic consideration. This is the only thing I am asking you to agree to in exchange for everything you have given in the last 5 days." The word exchange was deliberate, she realized. He had chosen it carefully. He was not commanding her or overriding her. He was offering a trade, which was the closest he could get, within the architecture of who he was, to asking. She picked up her bag. The secure wing was larger and considerably more beautiful than the staff quarters, which embarrassed her in a way she had not expected. The rooms were old and deeply furnished in dark wood and heavy fabric, lit by warm light, and there was a window that looked out over the city's nightscape, topped with the kind of view that made you feel like you were watching the world from inside history. He showed her the room and explained the ward system, which responded to her presence once he formally registered her, and she watched him do it with the deliberate care he gave to every protective measure he took, and she made herself focus on the practical significance of what was happening rather than the warmer and more personal significance that kept pressing at the edges of her concentration. "Thank you," she said when he was done. He stood near the door. He did not seem inclined to leave, and she did not want him to, and neither of them addressed either of those things directly. "Why did you really start reading the documents?" he asked. She looked at him in the warm light of the secure wing. His white hair, which had been impeccable in their earlier encounters, was slightly loose tonight, and the bruising from the silver chains at his wrists had faded to the pale gold of healing vampire tissue. He looked less formal than he had in any of the political rooms they had inhabited together over the past 5 days, and more like what she had come to think of as the actual him, the one she found in late-night archive rooms and early morning staff corridors. "I started reading because I thought if I understood the house I could navigate it better," she said. "That was true. Then I kept reading because it was interesting, also true. And then somewhere in the 3rd month I kept reading because of you specifically, and I didn't examine that too closely at the time. He was very still. He did the stillness like no one else she had ever encountered. Not the stillness of absence, but the stillness of enormous attention. "Because of me," he said carefully. "Because of who you actually were versus who everyone said you were." It was a puzzle I couldn't stop working on. And then it stopped being a puzzle and started being something else, and I had an employment contract, so I filed that somewhere and concentrated on the documents. The quiet that followed had a different quality from the functional silences they had shared while working. "You are the only person," Lazare said, with a precision that told her every word was chosen, "who has ever read me as something other than what is convenient for them to see. Most people see the danger, the council sees the threat. My father sees the heir, my enemies see the liability. You saw the archive room. I saw all of it," she said. "The danger too. I am not ignoring the danger. And you stayed anyway, and I stayed anyway." He crossed the room in that way he had, with the contained immediacy of someone who had decided something, and she lifted her face to meet his eyes because she was not going to look away from this. And for a moment they simply existed in the small space between them, with everything that had accumulated there over 4 months and 5 days. "This is not the right moment," he said very quietly. "I know, there are four more bloodlines to approach. 3 days remaining, I know that too. But when this is resolved," he said, and the rest of the sentence was in his eyes and not his words, and she understood all of it. "When this is resolved," she agreed. He stepped back. The distance between them resumed. But something had been said that did not become unsaid, and they both carried it into the following 3 days like a lamp that made everything slightly warmer. The 6th day brought an unexpected complication in the form of Lord Vesper Cain of the 5th bloodline, who was considered neutral in the succession question, and therefore an important target, and who greeted Nadia's presence in his house with the specific type of hostility that was dressed as condescension. "You bring your human," Vesper said to Lazare, with a smile arranged to look like politeness. "I bring my advisor," Lazare said, and the ease with which he said it, the absolute absence of apology or explanation, had a visible effect on Vesper's composure. "She is employed as a maid. She is employed by my house, which makes the nature of her current work an internal matter. Your interest in my staffing decisions is noted and declined." Nadia kept her expression neutral and thought about how much she liked him. The meeting with Vesper Cain was the most difficult of the week. He was not ideologically aligned with Erevan, but he was skeptical of Lazare's suitability in the way that some old bloodlines are skeptical of anyone younger than 3 centuries, which was a prejudice that logic alone could not address. He needed to feel something. So Nadia showed him the treaty frameworks, not described them, physically showed him the documents, 47 pages of draft framework that Lazare had been building for 11 years, every article reflecting a careful study of what had gone wrong in previous vampire-human agreements and a specific structural solution to each failure point. Vesper read for 22 minutes in silence. "Did you draft any of this?" he asked Nadia finally. "No. He wrote it alone over 11 years. I have read it. I could answer specific questions about it, but he is the author in every meaningful sense." Vesper looked at Lazare. "This could actually work," he said, with the slightly resentful tone of a man who had not expected to be impressed. "That is the intention," Lazare said. "Why has no one seen this?" "Because no one asked," Lazare said simply. "And I do not offer what is not asked for. It was." Nadia thought the most revealing thing he had said about himself in her presence, and she stored it alongside everything else she had been collecting since the beginning. Vesper Cain's endorsement came before they left the building. Day 7 brought Erevan's second move, and it was considerably less procedural than the first. She was returning from a secondary meeting with Seraphiel when the car stopped at a traffic light on the Upper District Boulevard. And the 2 vampires who appeared from the alley beside the road were not members of any council she had ever read about, which meant they were not operating officially. This was worse. Nadia was 3 blocks from Vandrak House, with a driver whose loyalty she had not had time to evaluate and no communication line to Lazare that would work at this distance given the city's signal architecture in the old district. She assessed the situation in approximately 4 seconds. The driver was already stopping. The stopping was too willing. She had approximately 6 seconds before the door would be opened from the outside. She took out the compact document recorder she had been carrying for archival purposes, spoke Heir Vandrak's name and the current location and the nature of what she was observing into it, and sent it to the only secured address she had memorized, which was Seraphiel's receiving archive. Then she picked up the heaviest object in the car, which was a legal case binder, held it, and did not pretend she was not frightened, but also did not pretend the fears it was going to make any decisions for her. The door opened. The next 3 minutes were not dignified. They were loud and disorganized, and she used the binder twice and her elbow once, and none of it was enough. Because the thing about vampires is they are genuinely physically overwhelming, regardless of your willingness to fight back, and she knew that and fought anyway, because the alternative was worse. She heard Lazare before she saw him, or rather, she heard the change in atmospheric pressure that preceded him. The way the air moved differently when he was moving at full speed, which was a speed that had no good human equivalent. The vampire who had her arm released her. Lazare had the second one against the car by the collar before either of them fully processed his arrival, and the controlled fury she had seen before in her disturbed room was present again. But this time it was operational rather than restrained, and it was the most intensely dangerous thing she had witnessed at close range in her life. He did not hurt them more than necessary to stop them, which she noticed and would think about later. He immobilized them, spoke 2 words in old-form vampire tongue that were clearly a formal command of some kind, and then turned to her. His hands were on her face before she could speak, tilting her head, examining the bruise forming at her temple, and the touch was so careful it was almost formal and also entirely electric, and she was going to have to think about that when she was not standing on a sidewalk 3 blocks from a house where an ancient council member wanted her dead. "I'm fine," she said. "You are not fine. You are bruised and you are frightened, and someone will account for both of those things. The driver. Seraphiel is handling the driver." He had clearly received her recording. "Can you walk?" "I could run if necessary." Something moved through his expression that was almost a smile, and also not at all a smile. "Walk, then, quickly." He kept his hand at her back the entire 3 blocks, and she let him. And the warmth of it was such a contrast to the cold of the last 3 minutes that she had to concentrate on the walking. Back in the secure wing, when the door was closed and the ward had resettled, and the immediate adrenaline was metabolizing into a deep and uncomfortable shakiness, she sat on the edge of the bed, and he sat beside her, without asking, and neither of them spoke for a while. "He is accelerating because he's losing," she said finally. "Yes. The bloodline counts are shifting and he knows it. The intimidation is desperation. Yes, we have 6 days left. We have 6 days left." She turned to look at him. He was close enough that she could see the specific grey of his eyes, which she had decided some weeks ago was the most accurate grey in existence, the grey of something enormous and old and careful. And his expression was doing that thing it did when he was not performing anything, when he was simply being, which was the version of him she had come to think of, as hers in the quiet part of her mind that had stopped pretending. "Lazare, Nadia. After we win this," she said carefully, "what does it look like, the crown, your father's formal succession? What actually changes?" He thought about it seriously, the way he thought about everything. "The treaty frameworks become policy rather than aspiration," he said. "The council balance shifts. Erevan loses his procedural influence. The Valaric petition expires. And the Human Employment Registry," he paused, "gets a formal advocate in the Crown's office for the first time in the Compact's history." She blinked. "That was in the framework documents," he said. Page 31. She had read page 31. She had not fully absorbed what it meant that it was there. "That is going to be very unpopular with a significant portion of the nobility," she said. "Yes, you put it in the framework anyway." "I put it in the framework because it is correct," he said simply. "Popularity is a secondary consideration to correctness. This is, I am aware, one of the reasons I am difficult to manage politically. It is also," she said, "one of the reasons I am sitting in this room instead of 3 blocks away on a sidewalk." He looked at her with the full weight of whatever he was, ancient and powerful and deeply private, and the things she had been filing away for safekeeping became impossible to keep filed. "I came to this house for money," she said. "And I stayed because you were the most interesting person I had ever encountered, and because what you were building deserved to exist, and because somewhere along the way it stopped being about either of those things." "What did it become about?" His voice was very quiet. "You," she said, "specifically and irreducibly you." He lifted his hand and touched her face, not checking for injury this time, just touching her face, the back of his fingers against her cheekbone, with a reverence that made the shakiness from before return in a different and considerably more pleasant form. "The fraction of a second when I saw what was happening in that car tonight," he said, "was the longest fraction of a second I have experienced in several hundred years." She covered his hand with hers. "I sent the recording first," she said. "I know." And something in his voice broke slightly at that, in the way that very strong things break, not catastrophically but precisely, along a specific line of truth. "You sent the recording first." She understood what that meant to him, that even in that moment she had been protecting the mission, protecting what they were building together. He had not asked her to be that person. She simply was. She turned her head and pressed her lips to his palm, and the sharp intake of breath he made was one of the most human sounds she had ever heard from him. 6 days, she said against his hand. 6 days, he agreed. And when she looked at him, he was looking at her the way she suspected she had been looking at him for a while now, with the particular helplessness of someone who has run out of reasons to pretend. He did not kiss her that night, which was a choice she respected and also found extremely difficult. He stayed until she had stopped shaking entirely, and then left her to sleep, and she lay in the old and beautiful room and listened to the city outside the window and felt entirely differently about the next 6 days than she had about any previous 6 days. Day 8 was 3 bloodline consultations and a formal filing with Seraphiel against Erevan for the unauthorized use of non-council agents, which was a blood law violation, sufficiently serious that it shifted the political ground noticeably even before any tribunal convened. Erevan's public response was measured and contained, which meant they were hurting him. Day 9 was the meeting with Lazare's father. Aldrich Vandrak was not what she expected, which seemed to be a pattern with the men of this bloodline. He was shorter than Lazare, his white hair long and loose. His age expressed less in appearance than in the particular density of presence that came with centuries of having been the most significant person in most rooms. He looked at Nadia for a long time before saying anything. "You are the maid who invoked Article 7, he said. "I am. You saved my son's title. I prevented a procedural violation." The title saved itself technically. Aldrich smiled, and she could see Lazare in it. The same controlled warmth that was all the more valuable for being rationed. "Lazare tells me the endorsement count is at 5, Aldrich said. "We believe we can reach 6 by day 12, Lazare said. The Thalcor bloodline remains uncommitted, but their primary objection is historical rather than substantive. With the treaty frameworks properly presented and the Erevan violation on record, we think the historical objection loses its weight." "And the 7th? "We are not counting on Belmore," Lazare said. "We do not need 7. 6 is sufficient for consolidation." Aldrich studied his son for a long moment. "You are operating differently than you have before," the elder vampire said. "Yes, the approach, the coalition strategy. It is more human in its architecture than I have seen from you." "I have had good counsel," Lazare said, and his eyes moved to Nadia briefly. Aldrich followed that look and seemed to do a great deal of internal accounting in approximately 2 seconds. He looked at Nadia again. "What do you want from this?" he asked her, not unkindly, genuinely. "What I want is not a political calculation," she said. "But since you're asking in that context, I want the treaty frameworks implemented. I want Article 31 of those frameworks operational within the Crown's first year. And I want Lazare on the Crown he has been building toward for 11 years. What do you want that is not political?" Aldrich pressed. She looked at the elder vampire and decided that honesty had served her well enough this week to be worth continuing. "The same thing," she said, "just also personally." Aldrich laughed. It was a genuine laugh, and beside her she felt Lazare's extremely well-controlled surprise, because she gathered that laughing was not something his father did with regularity. 6 endorsements by day 12, Aldrich said. You'll have my formal support registered with the compact office by tomorrow morning. The Theltaka bloodline took the entire presentation and the full weight of the treaty frameworks and 3 hours of careful conversation, and in the end gave their endorsement not to Lazare but to the framework, which amounted to the same thing and was, Nadia privately thought, exactly how it should be. That was day 11. Day 12 began with Heir Vandrak filing a counter-petition, which Seraphiles described as desperate, legally tenuous, and extremely dangerous in the way that a wounded predator is dangerous, not from strength, but from the willingness to cause maximum damage on the way to the inevitable outcome. The counter-petition claimed that the endorsement process had been conducted under human influence in violation of the purity of council blood law, which was an old-world statute that had not been successfully invoked in 200 years and was considered largely ceremonial, but which required a formal tribunal response, and which, crucially, created a 72-hour window during which the endorsements could be temporarily suspended. 72 hours took them past the Valaric petition deadline by 4 hours. The room in which they all convened to receive this news was very quiet for a long time. He does not need to win the tribunal, Lazare said finally. He only needs the delay. Yes, Seraphiles said, Nadia was thinking. She had been thinking since the moment she heard the term purity of counsel. The purity of counsel statute, she said. Who does it protect? It protects the bloodline heir from improper influence by parties with personal interest in the outcomes, Seraphiles said. Who determines personal interest? The compact tribunal. And the tribunal is convened under the original compact articles. Yes, then, Nadia said carefully, under Article 14 of the original compact, any witness who testified in a formal compact proceedings is entitled to formal party status in any subsequent proceeding that references their original testimony. My witness statement from the night of Lazare's title stripping is the foundation document for all subsequent actions, which means I am a formal party to this proceeding. Seraphiles was very still. Formal party status includes the right to submit counter-documentation within 6 hours of a filing, Nadia continued, rather than the standard 72. If the counter-documentation is filed within 6 hours, Seraphiles said slowly, and accepted by the tribunal, the original petition is paused pending review rather than automatically generating the suspension window. Yes. The counter-documentation would need to demonstrate that the purity of counsel statute does not apply in this instance, which would require establishing that your role was formal and procedurally sanctioned rather than personal. My witness statement from day 1 formally established my presence as required compact function, Nadia said. Every subsequent role I took was referenced in communications to council representatives by name, which establishes official function, and, she paused, Lazare formally registered my presence with his wards as a security function, which creates a formal household record, which establishes formal household status, Seraphiles said, very quietly, which is sufficient for the statute's definition of sanctioned party. It is not airtight, Nadia said. Erevan will argue the personal interest aspect, but it gets us to a contested hearing instead of an automatic suspension, and a contested hearing can be scheduled by compact rule within the current 12-day window. Lazare had been watching her through all of this with an expression she had learned to read as the intersection of deep focus and deep feeling. He turned to Seraphiles. File it, he said. Seraphiles filed it in 4 hours and 38 minutes. The tribunal was held on day 12 at the compact house, which was a building older than the city surrounding it. All dark stone and formal gallery, and the weight of centuries of blood law pressed into every surface. Nadia sat at the formal party table and presented the counter-documentation, and answered 3 hours of questions from a tribunal panel that ranged in their hostility from openly dismissive to thoughtfully engaged. The chair of the tribunal was a vampire named Hell, who had served the compact for so long that his white hair had taken on the silver tone of truly ancient vampires, and who asked every question with a precision that told her she was being evaluated not just on her legal argument, but on something less definable. You understand, Ocean said near the end, that if this counter-petition succeeds, you will have directly enabled the succession of a vampire crown, a human maid. Employed as household staff, yes, she said. Does that concern you? She thought about the archive room, the treaty frameworks, the coat with her name on the label, the hand against her cheekbone in the secure wing. Not remotely, she said, because I know who is being crowned. Ocean Hale looked at her for a long time. The compact must consider, he said finally, whether there is personal interest present that could compromise the purity of the proceeding. I will not insult this tribunal by pretending there is no personal dimension to my involvement, Nadia said, because she had decided in the last hour that honesty was not just tactically useful but morally necessary, and that the tribunal deserved the real answer. There is, it is significant, and it is real, and it has been present since approximately the 3rd month of my employment. But the actions I took were procedurally correct at every step. The personal feeling did not create the procedural correctness. They exist simultaneously and independently. The compact article does not disqualify a witness for having personal feeling. It disqualifies a witness for allowing personal feeling to compromise procedural integrity. I submit that the record demonstrates no such compromise. Silence in the compact house. 30 seconds of it. The tribunal will deliberate, Ocean Hale said. The deliberation took 40 minutes, during which Nadia sat in the gallery beside Lazare, who was present as the affected party, and neither of them spoke. His hand was on the armrest between their seats, and at some point her hand settled over it, and he turned his hand over and held hers, and they waited together in the formal silence of a building older than the city, with the answer to the next several centuries hanging in the air between its stone walls. The tribunal returned. Erevan's counterpetition was denied. The suspension window was not restricted. The Valaric petition deadline passed at 4:17 in the morning of day 13 without a filing, because without the suspension window, the Valaric line had no viable grounds. At 9 in the morning of day 13, Aldrich Vandrak formally transmitted his succession to his son in a ceremony that was private and brief and witnessed by Seraphile, and the 6 endorsing bloods and 1 human advisor, who stood at Lazare's right because he had placed her there, and she had not moved. Lazare Vandrak was crowned heir confirmed on the 13th day, with the weight of 6 bloodlines behind him, and a counter-petition on record that would change how the blood law was interpreted for generations, because for the first time the compact had formally recognized that personal feeling and procedural integrity were not mutually exclusive, and that a human party could hold formal standing in the oldest court of vampire law in the city's history. Erevan Dusk resigned from the Obsidian Council before the Compact House announced a formal review of all procedural challenges filed in the preceding 2 years. Article 31 of the treaty frameworks was submitted to the Council of Bloodlines for ratification, with Lazare's formal endorsement and the public support of all 6 aligned bloodlines. Nadia stood in the east corridor of Vandrak House in the late afternoon of day 13, in the same spot where she had set down a silver tray 11 days ago, and felt the strangeness of still being here, of the world having changed this much, and the corridor being exactly as she had always known it. She heard him before she saw him, or rather she felt the shift in air that she had come to associate specifically with him, the particular quality of attention moving in her direction. The formal succession is complete, Lazare said. He had changed from the ceremony clothes into something less formal, which on him still looked like a considerable event. His white hair was down from its ceremony arrangement, falling to his jaw. He looked, she thought, like himself. I know, she said. I was there. You were. He stood across the corridor from her, and it was exactly the geometry of 11 days ago, the same space between them, the same quality of everything accumulated in it. You are no longer employed as a maid, he said. No. I imagine that contract was functionally dissolved somewhere around day 3. Seraphile has drafted a formal advisor contract, he said. If you want it. What does it cover? Treaty framework implementation. Human rights advocacy within the compact's structure. Formal parte status in any bloodline proceedings touching the new governance policy. He paused. An office in the archives subfloor. It has better light than the section where you used to read. She looked at him. You know about that. I knew about it on day 4 of your employment, he said, and something in his expression was as close to fond humor as she had yet seen him manage. The archive room has a monitoring system. I watched you for 6 weeks before I understood what you were doing. Then I watched for another 6 weeks because I wanted to see where it led. You could have told me you knew. I was curious what you would do if I didn't. She crossed the corridor. The space between them closed to the distance of a heartbeat. And now you know, she said. I know a great deal more than I knew when you arrived, he said. And I am still learning, which is not something I have been able to say in a very long time. She reached up and set her hand flat against his chest, over his heart, because she wanted to, and because the 11 days had taught her that with him the direct approach was not presumptuous but honest. And honesty was the specific language he responded to most deeply. His heartbeat under her palm was slow and steady in the vampire way, unhurried, enormous. The arrangement I want, she said quietly, is not an advisor contract. No, he agreed, it is also not mutually exclusive with the advisor contract. No, it is not. He brought both hands up and held her face with the same carefulness he had used in the aftermath of the car, as though she was something worth protecting, which she had come to understand was how he experienced everything he valued, with a seriousness of purpose that some people read as severity and she now read as devotion. You came to this house for money, he said. I did, and you stayed for reasons that became impossible to file away. Very impossible, she said. Completely unfileable. He kissed her, finally, in the east corridor where everything had begun, and it was careful and certain at the same time, in exactly the way he was careful and certain at the same time. And it was also the single most significant thing that had happened in the corridor's considerable history. When he lifted his head, she was looking at him with the expression she had stopped trying to hide approximately 11 days ago. The treaty frameworks, she said, slightly breathless. Article 31. Will be ratified within the year, he said, with the absolute conviction of a man who has decided something will happen, and has not yet encountered anything that successfully prevents him from making things happen. And after that? Article 31 opens the framework for further amendment. There are 16 additional articles I have drafted in provisional form. I expect it will take several decades to work through them properly. Several decades. She was human. She was going to age while he remained what he was. She had thought about this. She had thought about it in the secure wing and in the compact house gallery, and in the late hours when the treaty frameworks were spread across the study table and they were both reading by lamplight. It was the honest question that every version of this involved, and she was not going to pretend it didn't exist. We should talk about the decades part, she said. Yes, he said, and he did not look away from her eyes, and he did not sound uncertain. There are options available to those in formal partnership with a vampire of crown status. They are not simple, and they are not without their own questions, and I will not raise them as decisions to be made tonight or even this season, but I raise them as existing, because they exist, and because I am not having this conversation without you knowing that I intend it to be a very long one. The warmth of that settled through her like sunlight, which was an irony she appreciated. A very long conversation, she repeated. Historically, my conversations with you have been among the most productive and interesting I have had, he said, with that contained almost humor that she had learned to treasure. I see no reason to schedule an end for them. She laughed, which surprised him visibly, and the visible surprise made her laugh harder. And then something in him relaxed completely, the last formal architecture of restraint, and he laughed too, quietly. In the east corridor of Vandrak house, with the city visible through the narrow windows and the silver tray still sitting on the side table where she had set it down 11 days ago. In the following weeks, the city changed in small ways that accumulate into large ones. The Compact's review of the procedural challenge filings resulted in the formal censure of 3 council members and the restructuring of the challenge process in ways that made it significantly harder to weaponize against legitimate heirs. Heir Vandrak was not tried because the political cost of a trial outweighed the benefit, and because his resignation and public humiliation were sufficient consequences in practical terms, which was a pragmatic decision that Nadia accepted while reserving her personal opinion on the matter. The Valaric bloodline, having missed their window by 4 hours and 17 minutes, filed a formal acknowledgement of Lazare's succession, which was the old world equivalent of a concession speech. The other aligned bloodlines began the formal work of treaty framework ratification. Article 31, which created the first formal human advocacy position within the Compact's governance structure, was ratified in the 43rd day after the succession, with 5 bloodlines in support and 1 abstention. Nadia signed the advisor contract and moved her belongings formally into the archive subfloor office, which did have better light than the corner where she had spent 4 months reading. The chair was considerably more comfortable than the staff room chairs, which she suspected was not coincidental. She was reviewing a draft amendment to the treaty framework, Article 9, on the evening of the 47th day, when Lazare came down to the archive and set a cup of coffee on the corner of her desk without speaking, which was the sort of gesture that required no commentary. She looked up at him over the stack of documents. "The Thalcor bloodline is requesting a meeting on the Article 9 language," he said. "I know. Seraphiel sent me their preliminary comments. I've drafted a response." He settled into the chair across from her desk with the ease of someone who has stopped maintaining formal distance, and picked up one of the draft amendments from the secondary stack and began reading it. She watched him for a moment. Reading her work in the archive subfloor under the house, where she had come looking for money and found something she had not known she was looking for, and felt something that was large and settled and deeply real. "You're doing it again," he said without looking up. "What?" "Looking at me as though you are working out a problem." "I solved the problem months ago," she said. He looked up at that, and the grey of his eyes in the warm light of the archive room was the colour of everything she now associated with safety and certainty. "Then, what are you looking at?" he asked. "Everything that comes next," she said. "All of it." He set the draft amendment down and leaned forward and held her gaze with the full weight of what he was, ancient and powerful and deeply devoted to the specific person sitting across from him in an archive room full of documents that were slowly becoming policy. "Everything that comes next," he repeated, with the gravity of a man who understood time in the way that very olden things understand time, not as a sequence, but as a substance, "is the part I have been working toward for 11 years. I am considerably more prepared for it now than I was before a human maid walked into my east corridor and read every document in my house." Several of those documents were in restricted sections, she pointed out. "I know," he said. "I moved the restrictions after month 2. She stared at him. "You wanted me to find them?" "I wanted to see what you would do with them," he said, with an equanimity she found simultaneously infuriating and entirely typical of him. She stood up, which brought her around the desk and considerably closer to him, and he stood too because he always met her directly, and the space between them was the good kind of small. "All those months," she said. "You were watching me read documents you had deliberately made accessible." "Among other things I was watching," he said, and the warmth in his voice was a thing she would never entirely get used to because it was so precisely calibrated and therefore so enormously meaningful. "If I had left," she said, "if I had taken your recommendation on the night of the chains and gone, I would have ensured your safety and supplemental compensation," he said, "and I would have experienced a very significant loss. And the endorsed campaign would have been conducted differently, and the framework ratification would have taken longer, and I would have continued building the treaty archives alone, as I had before you arrived, and it would have been, on every meaningful level, the lesser version of events." She kissed him in the archive subfloor, among the documents that were becoming policy, and the drafts that were becoming frameworks, and the history that they were actively rewriting one article at a time. He kissed her back with the certainty of someone who has made a decision he has no intention of revisiting, and held her with the care of someone who understands that the most important things require the most careful handling. Outside, the city continued, modern and layered, human and vampire, and every complicated negotiation between the two. The compact house stood as it had stood for centuries, older than the streets surrounding it, and inside its archives the record of a witness statement filed by a human maid on an ordinary night was being referenced in law for the first time, then the second, then the third. building towards something that would be cited in every major compact reform for the next generation. The crown that everyone had written off passed not through violence or political maneuvering alone, but through 11 days of careful, stubborn, brilliant work between a vampire who had spent 11 years building a world in isolation, and a human who had spent 4 months reading every document she could find, and who had stood in front of an obsidian council blade and invoked Article 7 because someone should, on the 100th day after the succession. Lazare formally proposed the long conversation he had mentioned in the East Corridor, in terms that were precise and serious and deeply personal, and not at all addressed to her employment status, and she said yes before he had finished the sentence. The treaty frameworks were fully ratified within the year, as he had said they would be. Article 31 became the most cited article in the following decade. The advisor who had first proposed its inclusion in the frameworks received her name in the compact's formal record next to the article's ratification, which was unprecedented, and which she considered the professional accomplishment of her life, alongside approximately 17 other accomplishments that were personal and not recordable in any archive. In the East Corridor of Vandrak House, the silver tray remained on the side table for 3 more months before someone finally returned it to the kitchen, by which point it had taken on the character of an artifact, something that had been present at a turning point and carried the memory of it in the way that inanimate things sometimes do. The city did not know, in any broad or public sense, the specific story of what had happened in those 13 days. What the city knew was that the succession had been resolved, that the treaty frameworks were moving toward policy, that the compact had restructured its challenge process, and that the new heir's formal household included a human advisor whose name had appeared in the compact record in a way that no human name had appeared there before. What Nadia and Lazare knew was everything that the record did not contain, which was considerable and ongoing and constituted, between the two of them, a private archive more extensive than anything in the subfloor room, built from 4 months of careful reading and 11 days of dangerous purpose, and a coat with a name on the label, and a hand against a cheekbone, and a laugh in an East corridor, and every conversation that had followed. The vampire heir that everyone had written off sat in the archive room in the small hours, reading the draft of Article 18, and across the desk from him the human who had proved him worthy of the crown was annotating page 12 with the focused care that she brought to everything. And the lamp between them was warm, and the city outside was quiet, and the centuries ahead of them were, for the first time, genuinely open. She looked up and found him watching her, as he had watched her from the beginning. Article 18 needs work, she said. I know, he said. I was hoping you would tell me where. She slid the draft across the desk to him, and her hand stayed in his when it crossed, and they read together in the warm light of the archive room that had started as her secret and had become their world, with everything before them and nothing between them, and the long conversation, the one with no scheduled end, well and truly underway.